She was near the woods when the sickness came. I saw her myself.
No, please, I swear by the saint.
Can stone walls stop an enemy that is dissolved in the very air? For centuries, castles were designed as ideal machines for protection against battering rams, catapults, and armed armies.
The Duke's seal is unmistakable on this document.
Architects thought through every angle of fire, the thickness of the gates, and the height of the towers to make the fortress impregnable to humans. But in the mid-14th century, an enemy approached the gates that did not need siege ladders or tunnels. The Great Plague knew no borders, classes, or moats, penetrating through the smallest cracks along with dust and fear. Lords and their garrisons found themselves trapped in their own fortifications, which had turned from bastions of safety into stone coffins. Watch the video to the end to learn the true cost of isolation and why even the deepest wells and highest walls often became not a salvation, but a death sentence for the castle's inhabitants. What if I told you that the very architecture of the castle, designed for salvation, worked against its inhabitants? For centuries, castle owners were accustomed to thinking in terms of direct military strategy, where the enemy was always outside and clearly visible. They sincerely believed that simply raising the drawbridge and lowering the heavy portcullis was enough to cut themselves off from the dangerous world. This tactic worked perfectly against infantry or cavalry, allowing them to wait out the threat in relative comfort and satiety. However, this confidence was based on hopelessly outdated ideas about war, where danger came exclusively from sharp swords and swift arrows. The psychology of the noble feudal lord was completely unprepared for a siege led by an invisible and inaudible enemy. This enemy made no demands for ransom and was not afraid of boiling tar. The people inside suddenly found themselves locked in a very confined space, where every breath and every accidental touch could be fatal. The crowding, which during a normal military siege was only an annoying inconvenience, now became a major risk factor. In peacetime, the castle seemed huge, but during the epidemic, it seemed to shrink. The garrison, numerous servants, craftsmen, and the owner's family were forced to share the same narrow stone corridors. They constantly bumped into each other on spiral staircases and breathed the same air in common dining halls.
We've been here for hours, same as you.
Sanitary conditions, which were already far from ideal in the Middle Ages, deteriorated rapidly in the face of overcrowding. The water in the wells could be contaminated, and waste disposal became a real logistical problem. No one could leave the safety of the walls, and psychological tension grew with each passing day. Neighbors who had been friends yesterday became a source of mortal danger today. People began to shy away from each other in the corridors, fearing even fleeting contact. At first, the forced isolation created a false sense of control and security, but this calm was quickly replaced by severe paranoia and widespread suspicion. Anyone who accidentally sneezed or simply looked too pale and tired instantly became an outcast. They began to be shunned as if they were already dead within an already tightly closed community. The atmosphere of mutual support dissolved into animal fear for one's own life. The familiar social hierarchy on which all medieval society was based began to crack at the seams. Fear of disease suddenly made the powerful lord and the lowliest stable boy equal. The disease did not distinguish between titles and ranks, and silk clothes did not protect any better than coarse wool. Servants began to fear their masters not out of respect, but out of horror that they might bring the plague from their chambers. The authority of the rulers fell when it became clear that orders could not stop the plague. Instead of providing reliable protection from the outside world, the castle slowly turned into a sealed vessel of death. Time passed completely differently here, slowing down to an unbearable pace, and the endless waiting became a sophisticated form of torture.
Tell me true.
The reliable stone walls now served not so much to protect against external enemies, as to prevent those inside from escaping. It was a strange siege without attackers, a battle without the clang of weapons. It was an agonizing wait for the end, with no understanding of the timing and no hope of help. Medieval people were accustomed to seeking protection and patronage from their lord in any incomprehensible situation. But this time, the lord was as frightened and powerless as a simple, dependent peasant. The entire system of vassal loyalty and protection collapsed in the face of a threat that could not be challenged to a fair fight. The castle, The eternal symbol of power and the immutability of the feudal system became a sad monument to human powerlessness. The forces of nature easily overcame the thickest fortifications, leaving man alone with his fate. I would be very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think was more frightening for the inhabitants of the castle? The threat from outside or the psychological tension inside? Write about it in the comments. Ready to learn the truth about how the trap that cut off the castle from the rest of the world was sprung? The first and most decisive step in the desperate struggle for survival was always the complete and unconditional sealing of the fortress. The decision was made quickly and harshly, allowing no objections or exceptions. The order to close the gates sounded not like a temporary precautionary measure, but like a final sentence for everyone. This applied both to the unfortunate ones who remained outside and to those who managed to get inside. Massive oak doors, thickly reinforced with iron, creaked as they were closed with heavy bolts. At the same time, the drawbridge slowly rose on rusty chains, banging dully against the gate frame. This action cut off the only physical route to salvation and escape. It symbolically and effectively divided the world into two halves: the pure, where hope still glimmered, and the impure, doomed to destruction. Thus, an insurmountable border was created, which no one had the right to cross on pain of death. The castle became a separate state,
My lord,
living by the laws of wartime.
unmistakable on this document. They are moving against you. Treachery!
From that fateful moment on, all contact with the outside world was completely cut off. Messengers with letters were not allowed in, even if they carried important news from the king or relatives. Merchant caravans with goods were turned away, regardless of the potential profit or need. The pleas of local residents who came from the villages to seek refuge behind the walls were demonstratively ignored. The Lord had to stifle his compassion for the sake of saving his own family and garrison. Even vital food supplies, which had previously been regular and welcome, were now seen as a threat.
It is dry.
Sacks of grain or barrels of wine were perceived as a potential source of infection that could destroy everyone. The lords and their advisors understood perfectly well that anything could bring death.
Our store.
Any object passed from hand to hand could bear the invisible mark of the plague. Therefore, the castles switched to using only their internal reserves, however meager they might be.
Outside the walls.
Life inside the castle went into siege mode, but it was a strange siege without the usual attributes of war. There was no clanging of swords, no crashing of battering rams, no furious cries of attacking soldiers. Silence became a new, frightening companion for the inhabitants, weighing on their ears and their minds. It was broken only by the muffled sounds of life in the courtyard and the howling of the wind in the chimneys. This silence was more frightening than the roar of battle because it concealed the unknown. The windows and narrow loopholes facing the outside world were often tightly covered with thick fabric. These cloths were pre-soaked in acrid vinegar or pungent wood resins. This was done to prevent miasmas and poison air from entering the premises. People believed that disease was carried by the wind and tried to barricade themselves even from the slightest draft.
Keep the miasma.
The dim light in the rooms only added to the general atmosphere of oppression and fear. The courtyard, usually noisy, colorful, and full of life, was rapidly emptying. It was turning into a restricted area with strict rules of movement and a curfew. People tried to leave their rooms as little as possible without extreme necessity. They moved quickly from door to door, trying not to linger in open spaces. It seemed that even the ground in the courtyard had become dangerous. The castle guards now changed their profile and protected the inhabitants not from enemy spies. Their main task was to protect against the invisible penetration of disease from outside or from farm buildings. Not only were new arrivals carefully checked if they miraculously managed to get in, but old cargoes were also inspected. Pantries and warehouses were examined for signs of spoiled food or the presence of rats. The atmosphere of trust disappeared completely, giving way to total control and self-isolation of each individual room. Every morning now began not with a cheerful inspection of the posts or roll call. The day began with anxious and quiet anticipation of news about the well-being of each member of the garrison. The castle turned into a kind of submarine that lay on the bottom, waiting for the storm on the surface to subside. And in this ringing silence, every random sound from the locked gates was perceived as an alarm signal. Everyone's nerves were stretched to the limit, like the string of a bow. But the closed gates could not protect against what was already in the air. And in the next chapter, you will learn how the inhabitants fought against the very breath of death.
Here, drink.
Want to know a secret that will change your perception of medieval medicine and architecture? The main and most dangerous enemy of the castle's inhabitants was not physical contact with the sick. The real horror was inspired by miasmas, that is, foul-smelling and invisible vapors floating in the air. According to the authoritative opinion of doctors at the time, it was polluted air that transmitted disease from person to person. Therefore, the struggle for sterile air purity became the main defensive strategy for survival. The castle was effectively transformed into a huge and complex inhaler, where every breath was strictly controlled. Huge stone fireplaces in the main halls were now lit around the clock, without a moment's respite. This was not done for warmth, as epidemics often occurred during the hot season. The fire was needed to purify the enclosed space with heat and acrid smoke. It was not just ordinary firewood that was thrown into the insatiable flames, but specially selected aromatic woods. Juniper, resinous pine, and noble oak were particularly prized. It was believed that their sharp and rich resinous smell could overpower the smell of death. The doctor assured that the strong aroma could neutralize the sweetish and nauseating smell of decay hanging in the stagnant air. Smoke filled the arched ceilings, creating a protective dome over people's heads. Eyes watered, but this was considered an acceptable price to pay for safety. The stone floors in the living rooms and long corridors were now covered with an unusually thick layer of fragrant meadow grasses. Servants brought armfuls of fresh lavender, peppermint, bitter wormwood, and fragrant rosemary. When walking, the dry and fresh stems crunched underfoot with a characteristic crunch. This process released essential oils that were supposed to serve as an invisible shield for all the inhabitants of the fortress. The aroma of the herbs mixed with the smoke, creating a rich bouquet of scents. The servants were instructed to regularly and thoroughly change this herbal bedding, preventing it from rotting. The old grass was raked up and immediately burned in furnaces to ensure that the evil that had accumulated in it was destroyed. This endless cycle of herbs was an important part of the daily purification ritual. Windows, especially those facing the dangerous side of the winds blowing from infected areas, were barricaded. They were tightly covered with thick woven tapestries or coarse oiled canvas. The fabric was often moistened with special compounds to act as a filter.
Feel the steam, child.
Medical treatises strongly recommended placing wide bowls of vinegar throughout the castle. This pungent liquid, slowly evaporating in the warmth of the rooms, was supposed to disinfect the space. The smell of vinegar became a constant background to life in the castle, permeating clothes and hair. It mixed with the aroma of burning resin. Noble people constantly carried special jewelry called pomanders with them. These were elegant, small perforated metal balls, often made of silver or gold. Inside, they were tightly filled with an expensive mixture of ambergris, musk, and exotic spices. This accessory became an integral part of the wardrobe and served as a kind of medieval respirator. It was held to the nose at the slightest suspicion of an unpleasant smell or when meeting other people. Those who were poor used sponges or pieces of cloth soaked in herbs. At the same time, the interior rooms of the castle were constantly and abundantly fumigated with church incense and yellow sulfur. It was physically difficult to breathe in such rooms, and the lack of oxygen and abundance of odors made one's head spin. But paradoxically, it was precisely this heaviness that was perceived by the inhabitants as a sure sign of safety and security. If the air was thick and smelly, then there was no room for disease. Easy breathing was considered dangerous carelessness.
Safer in here than out in the dark.
Fear of stagnant and poisoned air forced architects and managers to review the entire ventilation system of the castle. They did this as much as the massive stone masonry of the ancient building allowed. At certain hours, specific doors were opened and closed to create artificial drafts. It was believed that a strong wind would blow disease out of the corners of rooms like trash. Even during the night, people tried to cover their faces tightly with cloth or sleep under a canopy. They were afraid to breathe in the damp night air, which was considered particularly dangerous and harmful. Sleep became a test of endurance in a stuffy bed. No one wanted to wake up infected just because they breathed too deeply. This endless war with the air required a huge amount of valuable resources. Every day, mountains of dry firewood and stocks of rare oriental spices were used up, and the constant labor of exhausted servants was required. The castle lived in a constant gray haze of acrid smoke and suffocating incense. People desperately tried to mask the smell of impending doom with the smell of life. But even the purest and most fragrant air could not replace water. And if you like this, we will tell you how the fortress's most important resource was protected. What if I showed you a place that was both the source of life and the main vulnerability of any fortress? A lone well in the center of the paved castle courtyard was the only source of water in conditions of complete isolation. The fear of deliberate poisoning or accidental contamination of the water was so great that it changed people's behavior. Only the most trusted and reliable servants were now allowed to the source, often under the supervision of officers. The water was drawn from the depths with extreme caution and trepidation. Each filled bucket was first visually inspected for perfect transparency. Any cloudiness or speck of dust aroused suspicion and panic. Those in charge carefully monitored the absence of foreign impurities before allowing the water to be poured. There was a real, bordering on insane paranoia that the enemy could poison the underground waters, or the disease itself could mysteriously seep into the castle through the soil veins. Therefore, access to the water lifting mechanism was often blocked by a heavy padlock. The keys to it were kept personally by the castle manager or even hung on the lord's belt.
A small measure.
Water was used extremely sparingly, literally distributed drop by drop among the inhabitants. First and foremost, the resource was used exclusively for drinking and meager cooking. All other household needs, which people were accustomed to in peacetime, took a back seat. People learned to live with virtually no water consumption for daily needs. Washing clothes and mopping floors in the halls was reduced to an absolute minimum or prohibited altogether. Dirt was considered a lesser evil than thirst, so the inhabitants wore unwashed clothes. This was necessary in order not to waste a precious resource that could not be replenished from outside. The castle began to smell of unwashed bodies, but this was tolerated. Some advanced castles had ingenious systems for collecting rainwater in cisterns. But in the midst of a raging epidemic, such water was viewed with great suspicion. It was believed that rain, falling from the sky and passing through contaminated air, could absorb the miasma of disease. Drinking such water was tantamount to voluntarily drinking poison. Therefore, deep artesian wells were always given unconditional preference. The water in them had undergone long natural filtration through layers of earth and clay, which was considered a guarantee of purity. Cold underground water seemed to be the only pure substance in a contaminated world. If the castle had several independent water sources, it was a great blessing. In such cases, one of them could be specially preserved and sealed. It was an inviolable strategic reserve for the most extreme, catastrophic situation. It was kept for the moment when the main well would dry up or be poisoned.
There's sickness in this barrel. The men will panic.
Constant and strict control over water created serious social tension among the garrison. Thirst was a more understandable and real threat to soldiers than mythical invisible miasmas. Any change, even the slightest, in the familiar taste or smell of the water could instantly cause panic. This could lead to a riot by people driven mad with fear, locked within stone walls. Therefore, water samples were taken daily by a special person who risked his life. The responsibility for the cleanliness of the well rested entirely with the chief engineer or master. Any mistake or oversight could cost him his head on the chopping block. The condition of the water was monitored more carefully than the Lord's treasury. Water became the new currency, the main symbol of purity, and the only guarantee of survival in this stone bag. Each mug of clean water was perceived as a gift from God, prolonging life for another day. It was a very fragile balance between the physical need to drink and animal fear. Fear that an unknown death might lurk in the dark and damp depths of the mine. Guarding the well had become more important than guarding the fortress gates. After all, the enemy outside could not get inside through the high walls, but the water was already here, in the very heart of the fortress, and it could become a killer. But water was only half the problem of survival, because in the next chapter you will learn how the castles coped with the depletion of food supplies. Providing food in conditions of complete and prolonged blockade required strict discipline from the castle owners. This required careful planning long before the heavy gates were closed in the face of danger. The castle's damp cellars and vast storerooms instantly turned into veritable treasure troves. Now, sacks of grain and barrels of dried meat were valued here far more than gold and family jewels. The basis of the diet inevitably became long-term storage products that could survive winter and summer. Dried beans, rock-hard peas, heavily salted fish, and aged cheeses were used. Fresh meat, crisp vegetables, and juicy fruits disappeared from the dinner table in the first weeks of forced isolation. Memories of them became painful, giving way to monotonous, coarse, but nutritious food. The inhabitants' stomachs had to adjust to digesting heavy food, which often caused illness. Delicacies were a thing of the past, and now food served only one purpose: to keep people from dying. The castle administrators conducted a thorough inventory of absolutely all available supplies with particular rigor. They personally counted every sack of flour and every small barrel of wine with a pen in hand. Any unaccounted crumb could result in severe punishment or even execution for theft. Even the remains of grain at the bottom of chests were recorded in the barn books to calculate the time until the onset of famine. Accuracy in calculations became a matter of life and death for the entire garrison. A strict and ruthless rationing system was introduced, which affected all inhabitants without exception. The restrictions affected everyone, from the lord himself to the last stable boy, although the size and quality of the portions varied, of course. Bread was now baked exclusively from coarse flour, saving pure wheat for the sick. Bran was often added to the dough, and sometimes acorns, to artificially increase the volume of the baked goods. This allowed the dwindling supplies to be stretched out a little longer for an indefinite period. The cooks in the kitchen showed real ingenuity in these Spartan conditions. They tried their best to prepare at least somewhat edible dishes from monotonous ingredients. Often, the products were no longer fresh and had to be boiled for a long time with spices to mask the smell. The culinary arts turned into alchemy, where a hearty meal had to be created from nothing. But even the skill of the cook could not hide the taste of old lard and rancid flour. Particular maniacal attention was paid to the physical preservation of grain from destructive moisture and mold. The loss of the main product due to dampness would mean inevitable starvation and a painful death for all those locked up. Therefore, the grain was regularly shoveled with wooden shovels, dried and aired. Servants checked the bins for bugs and weevils that could destroy the supplies from within, unseen by the eye. The fight against pests was as fierce as the fight against the epidemic. Salt, necessary for preserving meat and fish, became the #1 strategic resource. It was kept in dry chests and used with apothecary precision, literally grain by grain. Without salt, meat supplies would rot in a matter of days, leaving the garrison without protein. The keys to the salt warehouse were entrusted only to people whose honesty was beyond doubt. Wine and beer completely replaced plain water wherever possible, and supplies allowed. Alcohol in the Middle Ages was reasonably considered a safer drink, not prone to rapid spoilage. Even children drank weak beer, as the fermentation process killed some of the dangerous bacteria. This meant that many of the castle's inhabitants were constantly in a state of mild intoxication, but this was considered a lesser evil than the risk of catching a fever from bad water. The usual noisy feasts and cheerful festive banquets with music completely disappeared from the castle. Food became exclusively biological fuel to maintain strength and life in the body. Meals became quiet, quick, and tense, devoid of their former luxury and social significance. People ate in silence, bent low over their plates, afraid to meet the gaze of their neighbors. The joy of eating vanished, leaving only the mechanical process of chewing. Every bite of stale bread eaten was a reminder that the supplies in the cellars were not endless. Everyone understood that there was nowhere to replenish them because the gates were closed and the fields outside were probably abandoned. The fear of real hunger was a constant, cold companion to this voluntary isolation. It made people secretly hide and hoard dry crusts and crumbs of food in their pockets for a rainy day. No one knew when the next full meal would be, and instincts took over. The ability to manage the pantry and distribute resources wisely became more important than the ability to wield a sharp sword. The keykeeper, who was in charge of the storerooms, effectively became the second most important person in the castle after the lord. His decisions and honesty determined whether the garrison would survive the siege or perish. His power was quiet but absolute, and even the knights tried not to quarrel with him.
No more, my lord. We will...
Are you ready to find out who posed a greater danger to the Lord than the plague outside the walls? In the cramped and confined space of the castle, the usual way of life was turned upside down. The servants, who, for centuries, had provided for the daily needs and comfort of their masters, suddenly became the main threat. It was they whose hands prepared food and cleaned clothes, who became a potential biological bomb. The lords and their families tried to distance themselves as much as possible from their own servants, forgetting about propriety. Inside the castle, exclusion zones were hastily created, where ordinary servants were strictly forbidden to enter. The service staff now underwent a daily and humiliating visual inspection in the mornings. Any signs of slight illness, whether paleness or perspiration, were interpreted as the beginning of the end. The managers examined the servant's skin for spots or boils with particular care. No excuses about fatigue or a common cold were accepted. Suspicion instantly turned a loyal servant into a dangerous enemy who needed to be isolated. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that servants usually lived in very cramped and poorly ventilated quarters. They slept huddled together on straw in common halls, which made them the most vulnerable group. In such conditions, infection could spread rapidly, affecting dozens of people overnight. These were ideal incubators for disease, located right under the noses of the nobility, and it was virtually impossible to change these conditions in an overcrowded castle. Strict internal segregation was introduced between the various groups of castle workers. Kitchen workers were no longer allowed to interact with the stable hands in the courtyard. Laundry workers were not allowed to enter the chambers and interact with the lord's personal servants. Groups of people lived in their own closed bubbles, unaware of what was happening in the neighboring wing. This severed social ties and turned the collective into disparate, frightened groups. This situation created a heavy atmosphere of mutual distrust and animal fear. Everyone suspected everyone else of hiding symptoms and secret illnesses. People began to watch each other, reporting to the manager if someone was coughing or had a fever. Friendship and solidarity crumbled in the face of mortal danger. The castle was filled with whispers and sidelong glances, full of suspicion. The servants, well aware of their unenviable fate in case of illness, often tried to hide the truth. They suppressed their coughs, pinched their cheeks to make them rosy, and hid their weakness until the last moment. This heroic but foolish silence only exacerbated the situation and led to the infection of others. The fear of being thrown out of the gates was stronger than the fear of dying in one's bed. This lie for the sake of salvation often became a death sentence for the entire castle. In some particularly large castles, separate outbuildings were allocated for servants. This effectively created a closed ghetto within the fortress walls, where the lords did not enter. Life there followed its own rules, and death there was also its own internal affair. The lords preferred not to know what was happening in these barracks as long as their meals were served on time. It was a state within a state, separated by an invisible wall of plague. Only the most trusted valets, who had direct access to their master's body, remained in a privileged position. They actually lived in his chambers, slept at the doors, and were completely cut off from the rest of the servants. They were forbidden to communicate with anyone from the outer circle so as not to bring in the infection. It was an attempt to create a sterile bubble of safety around the elite. For this, the comfort, freedom, and even lives of the other inhabitants were sacrificed. The social gap between masters and servants at these moments became an insurmountable abyss. It was now dictated not by ancient etiquette, but by a basic instinct for self-preservation. The Lord looked at his servant not as an assistant, but as a carrier of death.
Please.
All humanity gave way to a soul-chilling fear for their own lives and those of their heirs. The loyalty of the servants was severely tested when they saw the ruthless treatment of their sick comrades. Tension in the castle grew as the number of workers inevitably dwindled. The workload on the remaining healthy people increased many times over, exhausting them to the limit. Tired people made mistakes more often and became more susceptible to disease. The castle was turning into a maximum security prison with very strict rules for survival. Here, the guards feared their prisoners as much as the prisoners feared them. In the next chapter, you will learn how the inhabitants fought against the threat hidden in their own clothes and underwear.
Are the master's linen?
Sanitary measures in the castle took on the character of religious rituals, where fire and boiling water played a major role. Clothes and bedding were considered to be among the main carriers of disease, capable of accumulating and storing sticky germs. Washing became a complex technological process.
Ready.
Linen was boiled for hours in huge vats with the addition of ash and lye. Acrid steam filled the laundries, and the washerwomen worked themselves to exhaustion, trying to burn out the disease from the fabric with high temperatures. Clothes belonging to those who were ill or even suspected of being ill were not washed. They were immediately burned in furnaces or in the courtyard. The smell of burnt wool and linen mixed with the aroma of incense, creating the castle's distinctive scent of survival. Expensive fabrics, velvet and silk, which could not be boiled, were fumigated with sulfur smoke and aired in the breeze on sunny days. Sunlight was also considered a disinfectant, so on clear days the courtyards of castles were hung with airing tapestries and cloaks. People tried to change their underwear as often as possible, believing that clean fabric protected the pores of the body from the penetration of poisonous air. Old straw from mattresses was ruthlessly thrown away and burned, replaced with fresh straw, if available, or dry grass. Dishes and metal utensils were heated over a fire or washed in boiling water with vinegar after each meal. Furniture was wiped down with infusions of fragrant herbs and vinegar in an attempt to destroy invisible germs on wooden surfaces. Every item in the castle was checked with fire or caustic solutions before it was touched by human hands. It was an endless struggle with matter, an attempt to make the surrounding material world sterile with the means available. Getting rid of things, even valuable ones, became the norm if there was the slightest suspicion that they had come into contact with infection.
Move quicker.
The inhabitants of the castle lived surrounded by the smells of burning, lye, and vinegar, which ate into their skin and became the smell of life itself. Cleanliness became synonymous with safety, and dirt became a harbinger of death,
Stoked hut.
and this attitude dictated the entire daily routine.
Scrub every
Life in isolation did not mean a complete loss of interest in the outside world. On the contrary, observation became vital. The sentries on the towers and walls now scanned the horizon, not in search of enemy banners, but in an attempt to understand the scale of the disaster in the surrounding area. Smoke from funeral pyres in villages, the absence of movement on the roads, abandoned fields. These were all signs that the castle's inhabitants read. The walls provided a safe vantage point, creating distance between the observer and the tragedy unfolding below. Communication with the outside world was maintained through visual signals, flags, smoke, or agreed-upon signs exchanged with neighboring fortifications. Only fragments of information reached the castle, often distorted by distance and fear, giving rise to the most incredible rumors. The sight of empty roads once traveled by trade caravans had a depressing effect on the psyche of the imprisoned people. The world outside the walls seemed dead, and the castle felt like the last arc of life in an ocean of death. Sometimes people approached the walls begging for help or food, but the guards remained deaf to their pleas, following the cruel order to let no one in. These scenes at the gates became a heavy moral test for the garrison, forced to watch the suffering without the right to intervene. Feelings of powerlessness and guilt were mixed with joy at being on this safe side of the wall. Observing nature was also important. The behavior of birds, the weather, the direction of the wind, everything was analyzed for danger. The castle became an observatory where the footsteps of death were studied in an attempt to predict when it would retreat. The walls became a screen separating the audience from the drama unfolding on the stage of the devastated land. This view from above gave a false sense of superiority that could collapse at any moment.
And your final act is nigh.
The most exhausting and difficult test for the people locked in the stone castle was not the lack of fresh food or wine. The real torture was the endless, agonizing wait, which gnawed at the soul more than hunger gnawed at the body. The familiar and intense rhythm of feudal life, which for centuries had consisted of noisy hunts, military training, and lavish feasts, was completely destroyed. In an instant, an active life was replaced by absolute stagnation, for which no one was prepared. Knights and professional warriors, accustomed to constant action and movement, literally languished from idleness in a confined space. They wandered the corridors, unable to release their pent-up physical energy and aggression. Boredom became a dangerous and insidious enemy, slowly undermining iron military discipline. Yesterday's comrades began to quarrel over trifles, and conflicts arose literally out of nowhere. In order to somehow fill the frightening emptiness of their days, the inhabitants increasingly turned to religion and mysticism. People spent long hours in the cramped castle chapel, kneeling in prayer for salvation. The smell of incense and wax became as familiar as the smell of dampness in the dungeons. Religious ecstasy and public repentance became a mass phenomenon among the frightened people. They sincerely sought the cause of the terrible disaster in their own sins and vices of the past. Gambling with dice and complex chess games helped only briefly to pass the time between prayers. If books miraculously found their way into the castle, they were read until they were worn out, passed from hand to hand as the greatest treasure. But even reading fascinating stories could not completely distract from the disturbing and gloomy thoughts about reality. Women of noble birth found solace in endless needlework by candlelight. They embroidered intricate patterns and reworked old clothes, turning this monotonous labor into a kind of meditation. Time within the fortress walls had completely lost its usual linear meaning and significance. The days merged into one continuous gray strip, indistinguishable from each other. The days could only be distinguished by the changing of the guards on the walls and the time of mandatory church services. The seasons outside the window changed, but inside, eternal autumn of waiting reigned. The wait for the end of the epidemic was agonizing precisely because of the complete uncertainty of its duration. None of those locked up knew how long it would last. 1 month, a whole year, or an eternity. This frightening uncertainty weighed on the psyche much more heavily than the direct threat of war. People lost hope, ceasing to believe that the gates would ever open. People were forced to learn to live in a state of constant pause, putting their lives on hold. They were forced to freeze their ambitions, political plans, and personal desires until better times. It seemed as if the whole world had frozen, and only death continued its harvest outside the walls. It was a severe test of fortitude and faith. Not everyone passed this test, and many broke down not because of illness. People went mad with despair and the inability to influence their own destiny. The castle became a place where time stood still, turning life into an endless wait for a miracle.
And the roads.
The solemn moment when the heavy gates of the castle finally opened was no less dramatic than the moment they closed. This event was filled not so much with joy as with anxiety and fear of the unknown. The decision to lift the isolation was made with great caution and distrust of the silence outside. Often this happened only weeks after the last obvious signs of the plague had disappeared from the area. The first scouts went outside cautiously, keeping their weapons at the ready as if expecting an ambush. They stepped onto their native soil as carefully as if they had landed on the surface of a strange and hostile planet. Every bush and every tree seemed suspicious and threatening to them. The air of freedom seemed unusually sharp and dangerous to them after the stuffiness of the castle rooms. The world they saw before them was strikingly and frighteningly different from what they remembered. The landscape had changed beyond recognition during their absence. Deserted villages with boarded-up shutters greeted them with a frightening emptiness. Fields that had once been covered with wheat were now overgrown with tall weeds and bushes. An oppressive silence reigned where once there had been the hustle and bustle of rural life and the sound of singing. It was a shocking sight for the survivors, who were accustomed to the order and tidiness of their estates. Nature was quickly and ruthlessly reclaiming its own, erasing all traces of human presence. Roads had turned into footpaths, and bridges had fallen into disrepair without repair. The initial euphoria of long-awaited liberation quickly mingled with the bitterness of irreplaceable losses. There came a full realization of the monstrous scale of the catastrophe that had befallen this land. The joy of survival was overshadowed by the sight of destruction and desolation. In addition, food supplies in the castle itself were usually depleted to the limit by this point. Opening the gates was often a necessary measure, dictated by the need to find at least some food. Encounters with the few surviving neighbors were filled with mutual distrust and extreme caution. People shied away from each other, afraid of touching or shaking hands. They had to relearn how to communicate without fear and suspicion. looking their conversation partners in the eye. Social skills had been lost during the long period of confinement. Old social ties, vassal oaths, and obligations often lost all meaning in this new world. Money lost its value, giving way to direct exchanges of goods and food. Titles meant less than the ability to wield a plow or an axe. Society was rebuilding itself on the fly, trying to adapt to the harsh reality. The survival of the castle ultimately proved to be a classic Pyrrhic victory for its owner. The fortress stood firm and protected the people inside, but the familiar world around it collapsed. Nevertheless, those who survived this isolation became bearers of a unique experience. They were living witnesses to history who had gone through hell. Life began to slowly but surely return to normal. New families appeared, houses were built, and the fields were sown with grain again. But the lingering fear of the possible return of the Black Death remained in the memory of generations forever. This horror was passed down from fathers to children as a warning. The wide-open gates symbolized hope for the future and rebirth, but they also served as a reminder of human vulnerability in the face of invisible forces of nature. The castles fulfilled their protective function, preserving the lives of the chosen few behind thick walls. But the price of this salvation proved to be incredibly high for everyone. The story of the survival of castles during the Black Death is a chronicle of man's struggle against an invisible and merciless enemy. We have seen that thick walls and deep moats are useless against a threat that comes through the air and water. Isolation, which became the only means of salvation, turned fortresses into prisons where real dramas of the human spirit unfolded. The experience of medieval people shows that in extreme conditions, fear and discipline become the main tools for survival. Their methods, though naive from the point of view of modern science, were dictated by a desperate desire to live. What would you do if you were the owner of the castle? Would you close the gates forever or try to help those who remained outside? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new dives into history.
Please, the storm is nearly upon us. Let us